Skeptic Zone, a miracle of technology. A universe of reason, the Skeptic Zone.
Hello and welcome to the Skeptic Zone, show number 25 for the 10th of April 2009. Richard Saunders here with you. A departure from our regular format today. A couple of weeks ago, our good friend Ian Bryce, the challenge investigator for Australian skeptics, travelled up to Springwood in the Blue Mountains, just west of Sydney, to debate Reverend Ian Powell on the topic, Can we be good enough without God? What follows today is the debate in its entirety apart from question time, because that would have taken the show overtime. So sit back and enjoy this interesting debate with the two Ians as they debate, can we be good enough without God?
Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you to tonight's great Easter debate. Tonight is the sixth of these that's been hosted here at Springwood. My name is Graham Crew. I'm one of the pastors of the Anglican Church, and I'll also be your scrupulous chairperson tonight. We're pleased to be able to sponsor tonight in cooperation with the Australian Skeptics. Thank you for coming. I trust that wherever you are in your beliefs tonight, you'll be entertained, challenged, stretched and helped on your journey to the truth. We've sponsored tonight in the belief that faith and reason are not enemies, nor should faith fear questioning. Tonight's debate is offered in what we believe to be the true spirit of tolerance, that doesn't seek to coerce agreement, doesn't deny difference, but seeks to understand, respect and persuade those with whom we differ. There will of course be no voting for winners or losers at the end of tonight's debate. Following the debate, there'll be a time for questions and a complimentary supper to finish off the evening where you can debate till the lights go out. There is some information on the out in the foyer from the Anglican Church, and I'm not quite sure if we're able to get some information from the skeptics tonight, but that opportunity was offered there. My job as chairman will be to keep our debaters to time and in line, and I'm particularly looking at you, Mr. Powell,
Thank you.
who is a known supporter of South Sydney Rabbitohs, so immediately comes under suspicion.
This year.
The year of the rabbit this year, is it? So I'd like to hand over to Vicky Brassington, who's the lady who's put this together, and she'll introduce our speakers to us tonight. Let's thank Vicky.
Well, thank you, everyone. We have always sought in these debates to find two speakers who are articulate and passionate about the issues, and tonight we are fortunate to have two such men. Ian Bryce from the Skeptics, according to the ABC Radio National, was a Senate candidate for the Secular Party in 2007 federal elections. The Secular Party of Australia believes that non-religious solutions are needed for many of Australia's and the world's problems. He qualified in physics and engineering at Monash University and has pursued careers in telecommunications, aircraft manufacture and space engineering. He is a founding director of the Australian Space Research Institute, which is a volunteer group conducting space research and education. For 8 years, he's been a casual academic at the University of New South Wales, mechanical engineering, space vehicle design, and he does contracting. That's nice. He has been active on humanist and skeptics committees for many decades. He believes scientific principles can be used to shed light on many social issues, including religion, ethics, and the environment. Recently, he became an honorary life member of Australian Skeptics, with whom he has engaged for decades as a psychic investigator and mythbuster. So let's welcome Ian. Reverend Ian Powell is senior pastor of one of the largest city Anglican churches, St Barnabas Broadway, which has for many years had a significant ministry to students of Sydney University. Prior to this, he was chaplain to the Shaw School, and worked for some years full-time with the Diocese of Sydney as one of the chief missioners. Ian is one of Sydney's most sought-after Christian conference speakers and one of the best thinkers about how Christianity and contemporary issues interact. So again, welcome Ian.
Thanks, Vicky. Our debate format tonight is designed to allow maximum interaction and also time to allow our speakers to develop their cases. There will be a delicate 1 minute warning bell, and when your time has expired, a more vigorous ringing of the bell to indicate your time is up in the section. We will ask each speaker to have 15 minutes and then another 15 minutes to pursue their case, and then a 5 minutes at the end to summarise. And then we'll have an open time for questions from the floor. So keep that one in mind if you would. Our topic tonight: we can be good enough without God. It's been claimed by some Christians and some other faiths that without belief in God, there is no logical basis for either a moral code or personal motivation to do good. These claims have come under significant fire recently from the neo-atheists. Any web search of morality, basis of God, will turn up numerous recent critiques. And yet it was again the subject of a recent Sydney Morning Herald article by Christian researcher John Dixon, in which he claimed do-gooding remains a particular preoccupation of the faithful. So tonight's debate is both current and important. So I'd ask Ian Bryce to step forward to the mic and mount the affirmative case. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction and the opportunity to address you here tonight. I'm going to start by saying if we want to find out if we can be good enough without God, we need to perhaps compare the two competing theories, that one, our morals come from God, and two, they come from somewhere else. So I'm going to start by looking at the evidence that they came from God, and perhaps I'll read you a little passage from let's start with the Old Testament. And this is from Numbers chapter 31. And the Lord said to Moses, saying, "Take vengeance on the Midianites." And I'm going to select little bits of it from the passage here because it takes too long otherwise. "And they warred against the Midianites, just as the Lord commanded Moses, and they killed all the males. And the children of Israel took the women of Midian captive with their little ones, and took as spoil all their cattle, all their flocks, and all their goods. They also burned with fire all the cities where they dwelt, and all their forts. And Moses said to them, 'Have you kept all the women alive? Now therefore kill every male among the little ones, and kill every woman who has known man intimately. But keep alive for yourselves all the young girls who have not known man intimately.'" Now this is not an isolated passage. There are many such ones in the Bible, and I don't need to go through all of them. But do you think that indicates the source of morality for mankind? I don't think so. Let's look at how that would imply today. If you were carrying out God's wishes today, you here in Springwood, on this side of the mountains, would get on your mules, or perhaps a bus, and go over the mountains, perhaps to Lithgow, where another tribe lives that you could well be having a war with. And you would take everything they own as spoils and burn down their houses and kill all the men and kill all the boy children. And the little girl children, you would rip their clothes off them and examine whether or not they'd lain with man. If they had, you would kill them, and if you didn't, you would rape them. Now, I'm sorry to be so shocking to you, but that is from your holy book, that many Anglicans and other Christians hold up as their source of morality. And you can perhaps begin to see the difficulty that secularists have when they see that happening. So, in conclusion, to give the Bible and the other teachings their due, there are lots of good passages in there, of course, but equally well a lot of bad ones. Let's examine one more now. Now, most Christians claim that their God is Omnipotent, meaning all-powerful. Omniscient, meaning all-knowing. And also another word meaning all-loving. So let's just take one little passage here. This is from Exodus 4. And then Moses took his wife and his sons and set them on a donkey. And he returned to the land of Egypt. And then it goes on to say that the Lord met Moses and sought to kill him. Now let's look at that. What can we find wrong with that? Firstly, Moses was his best prophet. There's no doubt that Moses was trying to fulfill all of God's wishes. So Moses was his best friend and God sought to kill him. Does that indicate an all-loving God? And let's look at the word sought. The Lord sought to kill him. So clearly the Lord tried but was unable to kill him. So is that something that an all-powerful God would do? So you can see another of the difficulties that atheists and, in fact, I would even claim to say any person who's capable of analysing this book on its merits, the difficulties that they would face. Now I'm going to look at the claim that a lot of Christians make, and that is that it's the afterlife that causes them to be moral, the fact that they might be called in an afterlife to be accountable for their actions. Let's examine that claim again to see whether we can determine how effective religion is in making us good. Firstly, does anyone remember Professor Dr. Reverend John Lennox, who visited Sydney last year and participated in some debates? Well, he was asked on the radio why he thought there was an afterlife. And he said, well, being a mathematician and a scientist, I go by the evidence. And the evidence I have is that if there's no afterlife, Hitler would have got away with his crimes, and that's unacceptable, so it must be wrong. Well, scientists don't call that evidence, scientists call that wishful thinking. So if you're examining the claims of a religious person, you need to work out whether they're really evidence-based or whether they're wishful thinking. Let's see whether it makes priests. We know very well that there's a much higher rate of child abuse among priests in most of the Christian churches, including Anglicans and Catholics, unfortunately. So clearly, the threat of a retribution in the afterlife doesn't seem to work. It's not limited to Christian religions. There was a teacher in Africa who named a teddy bear Muhammad, and she was severely punished by the resident Muslims who imposed Sharia law there, and she would have probably been stoned to death if it wasn't for the intervention of Western countries. In Saudi Arabia, a young couple was raped, both of them, by those upholding religion. And in Pakistan there was a similar case where a woman and her friend were gang raped by people that were known to them. And it was only after Western outcry that the Pakistani government finally decided to pursue the rapists. Up to that point they locked up the woman and let the rapists go free. So how effective do you think religion is in giving us good morals? Let's look at Catholics. They can commit whatever crimes they like on earth in this life, as long as they confess and repent before they die. And if so, they can get into heaven anyway. So what sort of use would that be? Mormons can be prayed into heaven as long as their relatives donate $50,000 to the church. So, what sort of morality is that? And if you go to the Steiner school, they teach their cripples, all sorts of people in wheelchairs and with mental deficiencies, they teach them all sorts of things that they can't possibly do, the theory being that it's preparing them for their next life. So, how moral is that? And it's often said that Hitler and Stalin are glowing examples of atheists and the type of things they do. Well, no. The motto of the German SS was "God with us," which was written on every belt buckle. And if you mention Hitler and Stalin, you kindly forget Japan, the other partner in the Second World War. And the Japanese, of course, worshipped the sun god and the emperor as their divine beings and part of the Shinto religion, and they used that to justify all the crimes they committed by murdering thousands or millions of civilians in the Second World War, both in China and Korea and throughout Asia, and Pearl Harbor and Australia as well. And not only that, but you might have heard of the rape of Nanking, where the Japanese soldiers went there and raped virtually all of the young women of the Chinese city of Nanking, all in the name of upholding the emperor's glory. And you might also have heard of Saipan, where the 6,800 civilians committed suicide on the orders of the emperor as the Americans were approaching, on the basis it was better for them to die than to be captured by the Americans. I could go on and on. There are so many examples of this. The evangelist in the USA, Ted Haggard, was caught buying crystal methamphetamine from a gay prostitute. So, what sort of morals has his religion bestowed him with? So by now you're probably feeling pretty discouraged about your religion, maybe. But I don't want to have an entirely depressing evening, so maybe we can bring something a little bit brighter into it. So, we've examined how effective religions are in providing morals for their followers. Now we're going to look at the theory, because science goes on evidence and theory. We're going to look at the theory of morals now, and we're going to say that why do religious people believe that morals come from God? It's because lots of philosophers around the world and throughout history have thought into their mind to say, why am I religious? And the best they could come up with traditionally is sayings like, it's good to do good, and duty for duty's sake. These are all sayings by famous philosophers. And even the American Bill of Rights says we hold that these rights are self-evident. What this shows us is that if you look inside your mind and say, what makes me do good things, or makes my colleagues and friends do good things, you don't know. You can't tell by introspection looking into your own thoughts. So that fails. However, science has provided many of the answers to these questions. Philosophy hasn't, and science has, I claim. For example, we know lots of things about the mind. The mind is an activity of the brain. That's clearly established by science. And the main is that the mind and the brain are limited by their physical location, i.e. inside a person's skull or brain case, and it doesn't have any existence outside. For example, when I'm thinking, if something disturbs my brain, it'll affect my thoughts. But if whatever goes on outside my head, whether it's above it or beside it, has no effect whatever on what I'm thinking. So my consciousnness and reasoning goes on inside my head. Secondly, the location in time of the mind. All processes of the physical mind are physically limited to the existence of the brain, according to science. So before you're conceived, there's no possibility of the mind thinking or remembering anything. And after you die, after the grey matter stops conducting electricity and chemical reactions and decays away, again there's no possibility of that consciousness surviving and doing anything. So the physical location within the skull rules out astral travel and claims like that. And on the time basis, the limitations to the duration that the brain exists rules out things like past lives and afterlives. So I'm sorry, if you're counting on something, on the reward in heaven, there's no possibility of that. And how sure are we of that? Well, of all the creatures that have ever lived and have had a brain, if you add it up, it's something the order of 100 billion, which is a fairly large number, give or take a factor of 10. That's apparently the number of creatures that have existed that have had a central nervous system. And in every case, their mind has required the support of a brain. There are blood vessels and breathing apparatus and digestive apparatus and all that feeding the brain. So if you want to compare evidence for physical brain supporting a mind to minds existing outside the brain, the evidence is something like 100 billion to 0. And if you don't find that convincing, then I'd like to ask what number you would find convincing. So afterlives are out. These are the findings of science. Next, we find that the brain is fully dependent on a physical support, and hence the mind. For example, an oxygen supply, if you drown someone, they certainly stop thinking. It's affected by alcohol and drugs. and requires nutrients. If it was otherwise, then we would have a common defence in court. Your Honour, you say that my blood alcohol was 0.05, but it didn't affect my driving because my mind exists independent of my body. No one has ever used that defence as far as I know. Certainly no one has ever succeeded with it. So further evidence. So these are all things that science has told us about the mind. We also know that everything apparently about the human body, in fact all animals, is a product of evolution and developed in order to benefit survival. And it's quite clear that all of our behaviour developed in order to benefit survival, to have survival value, and morals and ethics and cultural systems are all in the same category. So it's easy to show that through, for example, game theory and the study of groups of people interacting, that human beings will have altruistic attributes and selfish attributes. And you can show by modelling the different bits of behaviour that if you've got a group of people, less than about 150 people, that's where each person can know most of the other individuals. And that means that if someone tricks you, they won't get away with it because you remember them. Perhaps that's why little cities like Springwood are probably more open and trusting than places like Rozelle and Sydney, where I live, where you can't possibly remember everyone's face and past behaviour, so they can get away with more. So the bottom line is that we know where ethics and morals come from. They're in support of survival, and we know that the method of passing down is through several mechanisms. The first is genes, which is packages of DNA from the parents passed on to the children, and the second one is memes, which is packages of behaviour passed down from parents and society to children. So if you want to know where your morals come from, the Y is for survival value in a group of people as we were evolving, say 100,000 to 1 million years ago, and the how is passed down by genes and memes. So to summarise that part of the talk, we do in fact know where morals and ethics came from. Let me give you a simple example of survival value. Imagine we've got a tribe in the jungle, and the chief is worried about getting stabbed while he's asleep, which would have been a very common thing. So what a better way to protect himself than to invent an invisible friend who looks after him while he's asleep, and also who's going to punish anyone who tries to kill him even after they're dead, by inventing an afterlife. So we can also see how religions came to be invented as they had survival value. Thank you.
Ready to go? Trying to get ripped off. Oop. Too confusing. I'll use that clock. Pointing side to. What's the best for you? Spring last time I came to Spring with the debate, I got a friend. I've had other friends. I'm not sure if Martin's here, isn't he? Is Martin? He's not here. Okay. Well, thank you for the last friend I got, and whether or not Ian and I end up with lifelong buddies like Martin and I have. I'm not convinced he'll achieve the resurrection yet, but we're still working on it. Well, here's the topic. Can we be good enough without God? And my understanding of a debate is that there's an assumed right that an audience has, and that is that the speakers will stay on the topic, that you've come here on a particular topic, not just to hear a general chat about God and etc., etc. So I'm pleased that Ian and I are both committed to that. And secondly, that you'll hear an actual engagement between us, that the key ideas that the two Ians raised, the other Ians will actually try and answer. This is harder to do because I've often watched debates where you end up with sort of 3 separate talks with occasional polite abuse comments about the other person's position. And so last week we organised at our church a chance for Ian and I to have a bit of interaction to try and make sure we knew something of where each other was coming from, so you get your money's worth, hopefully. Well, I guess tonight's topic is kind of, at least in part, do we need God to be good? Is it possible to be thoroughly good without God? And at one level, the answer to that is so screaming obvious. Of course. I have atheists in my family, some theoretical atheists, some just practical atheists who probably believe in God but live as if there isn't a God. And of course you can be a pretty decent person. And of course I could do exactly what Ian's done and find horrible atheists and go, there you go, you see, which I don't think proves anything. Every team's got shockers. Every family's got embarrassments. Well, certainly my family's mostly embarrassments, really. But, except my mum and dad. But, so I don't think much is gained by me just picking a number of horrendous atheists who say quite explicitly that their belief that there is no purpose and no value in human life is the reason why they did what they did. But there are any number, quite some famous ones. But I don't think we'll do that yet, although if you want to ask me a question at question time, you go for your life. I'd like to raise three issues and hope that Ian might address some of them. He might not have time. The first is the trickiest, and yet I learnt this from atheists. And I want to make that clear. In 1975, I read some work by some atheists, and they taught me this point, and it's this: that without God, the notion of goodness becomes almost empty of any serious value. It becomes very difficult to argue for good in contrast to evil with any substance and any weight and any oughtness if there is no God. On the whole, the English atheists like Bertrand Russell and that are just a pack of, well, they're English, they're Nancy boys, you know, and they say there's no God, but fundamentally they want to live, apart from normally from sexually, they want to live with roughly Christian values. And this became clearer, particularly with Bertrand Russell as he got older, kind of sort of whimpering sort of things about the darkness of life, and we just need some charity. And I was like, Bertrand, I'm afraid you can wish for it. Ian obviously doesn't like the story about the Midianites getting such a hard time, and I'd be happy to discuss that. It's difficult to deal with a complex story in a few seconds. But Ian doesn't like the story of people being murdered or raped. Well, frankly, so what if Ian doesn't like it? What is the significance of Ian within a genuinely gutsy atheist point of view? First principles. If you go back to first principles of atheism, we have roughly, as best we can understand it, energy. My understanding is that matter is the form of a way that energy works. We'll call it energy and matter, if you like. Seems to perhaps never have started. We'll grant that if you like. It's hard to imagine. Never started. It's not going anywhere. It's got no purpose. It's got no love. It just is. And by a long series of accidents that we might think are significant but aren't really, you have life. It's only here for a split second. It'll be gone before you know it. And we are just a form of energy. It is very difficult to go from that to say, therefore you ought to treat these small packages of energy in any particular way. Quite a number of atheists are willing to acknowledge all we're left with is preferences. And thank God, well, thank energies, that in the Western world anyhow, you can appeal to a group of generally agreed moral principles like we don't like rape, rightly. But if you're just a bunch of cells, you've come from nowhere, you're going to nowhere, there's no ultimate significance in the whole thing, it's just coming and going, that's just the way it is. Richard Dawkins was asked one time, interviewed, and people rang up, this is in England, and a woman began to complain and speak about what should she make in terms of Dawkins' point of view of the fact that she had lost her child. He said basically, get over it. Now he regretted that, because that's exactly what you expect. This is a meaningless, purposeless existence. English atheists, on the whole, and those who draw from them, tend to be gutless. And they want to draw a whole lot of moral oughts that grow quite naturally out of the Christian understanding of what's really there. You ought to be able to go naturally from what you think to be what is really there, first principles at the basic foundations of stuff, to what you believe about how you ought to live. There ought to be some logical connection. There is, of course, if Christianity is true. Now, unfortunately, we're not debating that topic tonight. I'd love to be, but we're not. But Christianity has this understanding at the very heart of the universe, not just that there's a God, a lonely monad, but there are three people in a loving community who love each other. And therefore, when you work out, well, how then should we live in this person's world? Where you live, what matters? Well, love is what matters. People are what matters. Relationships are what matter. It makes absolute logical sense if the first premise is true. Atheism, on the other hand, faces this terrible jump. They get away with it often because we all agree with them. And they say, we ought to treat people well. And we go, yes. I'll tell you the guy who taught me this. It was a man called Jean-Paul Sartre. Not personally, sadly. But in one of his writings, he has a story which illustrates what he believes to be consistent, thoughtful, gutsy atheism as against romantic, namby-pamby English atheism. Mind you, if you're English, I love you. You know, the world needs namby-pamby Englishmen, particularly in football teams. Sartre paints this picture. It's raining. He's driving. Presumably it's a Citroën because he's French. He's driving. There is a man hitchhiking. He's wet. He's cold. The man... Well, what do you do with him? Well, Sartre says because he is worth nothing and there is no ultimate right or wrong, it's absolutely a valid thing to pull over, pick him up, drive him right to his door, go out of your way and drop him home. It is equally as valid to swerve and run him over and kill him. I see, and he's quite serious. Because he says, you are worth nothing, he is worth nothing, he's going to be dead in a split second anyhow. You've simply arrived at the destination earlier. The problem is, you see, we have a bully of a culture. The culture is a bully. It says, we don't like that behaviour. We will imprison you. At that point, we need to raise a voice against the bullying culture and say, if that person has acted with integrity within his own value system and has been true to himself, how dare you impose your imperialistic ancient values on them? In the end, you see, it's atheists who raise with great power and often with terrible despair the ultimate logical, rational, coherent conclusion that if in the end, at base reality, there's just energy or just stuff, it does have massive impact on how you should then live. So when atheists speak of human rights, they're singing a tune that doesn't belong to them. When we had the quote from the American Constitution, it's far better for me to quote the American Constitution, but let's at least, as we should do with the Old Testament as well, finish the quote. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If in the end you take the source out of it, which is it's because of God that people have these rights, you've got to give up the rights as well. What atheists consistently do is destroy the foundations, remove the walls, but they want a floating roof. And in the end, they've got to have enough guts to say, we don't own that roof. Right, we're not going to claim old-fashioned Christian values. We're going to have enough guts to go with it. I can come back to that, but I think in the end we've got to hear more than just, we don't like rape, therefore the Bible's no good. Because it's got this story. Although it doesn't actually talk about the girls being raped, and there's a very good reason why the Midianites were put to death, which we can go back to. Secondly, if it's true that without God, goodness actually becomes this light, sort of valueless thing, it's really preferences. I like, rather than good or evil, right or wrong. The second thing in this, I think, with this, can we be good enough without God, is that without God, when people talk about goodness, it's normally pretty bland stuff. It's normally, I didn't murder anyone, I generally paid most of my taxes, I occasionally gave a few bucks to charities. And then you have super saints like Fred Hollows, who was a very impressive guy and did some great work, of which he learnt actually from a Jesuit priest. That's where he first learnt to do that work and the significance of it in central Australia. And I remember being amazed at the school that I served at how impressed the people who knew nothing of Christian history were with what Fred did, that he would go for a month or two sometimes to dangerous places to fix eyes, and I was glad he did it, and it was impressive. But see, if you know anything about missionary history, it's nothing. He had his dirty, big, huge house in North Sydney. He still lived as a wealthy Australian. Do you remember when we started to hear about the hospital in Addis Ababa, middle of Ethiopia, these two doctors who went and lived there for decades? When did we hear about them? When the husband died and they needed a replacement. Front page of the Herald. I remember reading it. I was saying to my wife, Shelley, these people have to be Christians. Only Christians would do that. An atheist may go for some time. I'm not saying, as a generalisation, there may be exceptional atheists. And, Fred Hollows, super saint. This is what Christians have been doing for decades. More recently, Slumdog's, that movie that came out. And on the front page of the Herald, there's a story about a couple who've been living in a slum. They're lawyers for 13 years in one room with a outside toilet that they share with other families. They've been there for 13 years. They're bringing up their kids. And I'm reading it saying, these people have to be Christians. Only Christians have got this sort of heroic, dangerous, stupid goodness. where you don't give a few bucks to World Vision, which you hardly miss. In the end, they were, and unlike the Addis Ababa one, the Herald actually admitted it, which was remarkable. They tend not to do that. Albert Camus, another great atheist, said this: "Can I be a saint if God does not exist? This is the only concrete problem I know of today." He writes that in the context of the book The Plague, where his great problem is fundamental indifference. He said, how do we get people who will have heroic virtue rise up and really reorder their lives if there's no God? Because in the end, as he says, you remain committed to your own personal ease with the occasional conscience-salving act of goodness as a generalisation. What you get with Jesus, of course, when if you do ask Jesus, what does it mean to be good? He says this. This is from the Sermon on the Mount. Is that just strange bell or is that a possum? Okay. He says, so what if you love your friends? He said the worst sinners in the world love their friends. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Pray for those who mistreat you. And then you will be true sons of your Father who is kind to the ungrateful and the good. In terms of real, robust, world-changing, heroic goodness, in the end I think you do need something more than just a let's be nice because it's nice to be nice sort of view. The God that Jesus speaks about, and I'm well aware, and Ian could have a great time with this, there's a zillion different contenders, and Christians are not fans of religion. The idea that we're not talking about religion, certainly as a Christian I'm not, there's religious people that kill Jesus. It's normally religious people that kill Christian messages. Religion is not in itself a good thing at all. In fact, often it's quite a dangerous thing. But we're talking about God as he is, and I take it he's made himself very clear in Jesus. So in terms of the strength of goodness, rather than bland goodness, I think you do need the God certainly that Jesus speaks about. And third and lastly, can you be good enough for God in one very real sense, assuming for the moment that God is real, and we may need to talk about that for a few seconds. The answer from Jesus is clearly no. Man comes up to Jesus and says, good master, hold it. Why do you call me good, he says. No one is good but God alone. We tend to use good in a really bland way, and Jesus says, no, if you want to add goodness, let's talk about being like God. And what Jesus takes the view is that you and I all have trouble with God because we're not good enough for God, and if God doesn't help us, when we do stand before him, you are going to be in trouble, and so am I. I deserve without a shadow of a doubt to go to hell according to Jesus, and I believe it. It's not why I'm a Christian. No. The thought of me going to hell hardly ever crosses my mind. It's not reward in the afterlife. That's much more like Islam than Christianity. Right. But what we have is a God who is gracious and says, in your hopeless case, you're very valuable, you're very precious, you're very broken, you're in my image but you're damaged, you do good, you do bad, but I love you. And I've done this thing in my son Jesus so you can be forgiven. And so in a sense, can we be good enough for God? No. Can we be good enough without God? Good enough for what? For a bland, ordinary, fairly boring life? Self-justifying? Yeah, we can do that. Can we live that heroic? See you later.
Thanks for that response, Ian P. Which of your points will I address first? You said we do need a God to be good. Well, I'd like to ask how you determined which God you need. I find that most Christians think that this is the one true God. In fact, if we look at the website of the Springwood Winmalee Anglican Church, it discusses that topic at some length and concludes that Christians are the ones with the one true God. How they reach that conclusion, I'd like to know. I've got here a collection of holy books. I've shown you the Old and the New Testaments, and you'll find that in that God says again and again that he's the one true God. In fact, the first 4 commandments are dedicated not to mankind's benefit, but to God's benefit, that he won't erect any graven images and so forth. So that's a pretty bad sign that God's looking out for us. Secondly, I have a copy of the Bhagavad Gita here, which is the text that many of the Eastern religions rely on, that and other ones. Let me read you a passage from that. This is chapter 10, text 5. And it says, all these various qualities of living beings are created by me alone. The speaker being Lord Krishna. So again we see that the Eastern religions think that theirs is the one true God, and their God is so jealous he cannot tolerate any other gods. I have here a copy of the Holy Quran. Let's see what it says about one true God. Here we're in Surah 43, section 6. When Jesus, the son of Mary, is held up as an example, behold, your people raise a clamour thereat in ridicule, and say, are our gods best or he? So again, the Muslim God is saying that he's bigger and better than the other gods. And you'll find that I've given you 3 examples there, but in my collection of holy books, virtually every religion claims the same thing. They put a lot of effort towards discounting the others. So if there was a real one true God, his marketing strategy has been a dismal failure. In fact, it's faded into the background. His holy book has been totally indistinguishable from any of the others. Now, Ian referred to Jesus giving the good advice that we should turn the other cheek when someone wrongs you. Well, that's the New Testament being at variance to the Old Testament, because the Old Testament says you should take an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which is quite the opposite of turning the other cheek. And in fact, that's often called tit for tat, which is an expression used by secularists. For example, Peter Singer and other humanists who have studied optimum human behaviour in groups of various sizes has a book called Tit for Tat. And that shows that when you're living in a society of a certain size with certain rules of behaviour, your best strategy is that if you meet a stranger, you should firstly give them the opportunity to be trusted, but limiting your exposure. And if they treat you well, you treat them well in return. And if they wrong you, then you never trust them again. So that's tit for tat. So the Old Testament versus the New, and the secular view says that tit for tat seems to be the best way to go, not turning the other cheek. Gandhi turned the other cheek, and look where it got him. Now, which point will we address now? Ian spoke about the universe being just energy and matter, and hence there's no origin of the term ought or should in morals. Well, I can only agree there and say that science, however, does tell us that the human mind exists, as I said, based on the brain, which I explained in some detail. By the way, all of my claims here, if you're thinking I'm making assertions, then you can go to my website, worldtruthday.org, where some of these things are backed up in more detail, or if you do a simple search in Wikipedia or something like that, you can find out further information. Anyway, scientists know that the human mind is the most complex item in the universe that has yet been discovered by man, and it's the most amazing and astounding piece of computing power. And the fact that it can be explained in terms of chemistry and electrical signals doesn't lessen it in any degree. I think that Ian is a kind of mysterian. That means a person who wants there to be mystery, who doesn't want there to be explanations. And I take it that if scientists were to find an explanation for God, that Ian would then discount it and say, oh, it's not good enough, it's got to be mysterious, it's got to be unexplained. Because that's what Mysterians do. So rather than relying on a mind which created the universe and for which there's no evidence at all, scientists and secularists say that the human mind is the most complex and admirable piece of engineering, or whatever you want to call it, in the universe, certainly not arriving through intelligent design, and that is where oughts and shoulds arrive from. And if we look at the way lions behave in catching their prey, clearly there's no ought governing the behaviour of a lion to, say, a baby zebra that it's chasing down to eat. The lion has some oughts in the way it treats other lions, and the lioness and its family, but whether oughts exist or not in the universe is purely a matter of survival value, and it depends on whether you're talking to someone in your in-group that you need to respect, and will get respect in return, or whether you're talking about an out-group that you can murder with no consequences. So questions of ought and should have been well solved by science. So what sort of morals will secularists come up with? Well, because we know where morals come from, or scientists have shown that, we're free to construct our own morals and ethical systems. And the way that most of us choose to do that is called respect for sentient beings. And that's based on the idea that I feel pleasure and pain, and I know the people around me also experience pleasure and pain because they have a brain scan, their brain's the same as mine. So the problem of other minds has been solved by science, not by philosophers. We know other people have minds and other animals have to a lesser degree. They can experience pleasure and pain, and we care about their experiences. Therefore we have respect for sentient beings. That's the core paradigm of my philosophy. And that can be quantised in the study of utilitarianism. How many of you have heard of utilitarianism? Okay, that's pretty well known. Well, that basically puts figures to the study of respect for sentient beings, and even a degree, perhaps. So that, for example, if you've got they do analogies with trolleys, little stories called trolleyology, with the trolleys running down the hill on rails, and it's going to kill one person on the railway tracks, and if you pull a lever you can divert the trolley, and instead it'll kill 3 other innocent people who are tied up on the other track, and should you do it? The churchman would usually say, no, we shouldn't intervene because it's God's will, whereas the secularist would say, well, you've got to weigh up the death of one person against the death of 3, and if that's all there is to it, maybe you should divert the trolley. But they could also say that if you do that, you might not be trusted again, so there are factors on either side. And anyway, you can calculate to some extent the number of sentient beings affected and the degree to which they're affected. And that's basically the system of ethics that secularists and humanists and skeptics and so forth come up with. And finally, I'd like to address again the notion of goodness. I think Ian made it quite clear that he believes that without God there is no source of goodness for people to follow. Well, I would just again hold up the Bible and see what source of morals and goodness that gives us, and look at the core paradigm of Christianity, which of course would be the crucifixion and the atonement. Christians describe their core Christian tradition being the atonement, something like this, that mankind and God had some sort of covenant. Not exactly clear what that was. And when Adam ate the apple in the Garden of Eden, he broke that covenant. Whether he was really eating an apple that was forbidden, or whether he was having illicit sex, or whether he broke some other law, it's not exactly spelled out. But in any case, he broke something that God thought he had promised to do or not do. And every new generation since then, even the little babies, are born with ancestral sin that had to be cleansed in some way. That's an extremely obnoxious idea to a secularist who believes that people are not inherently bad and you don't need to punish babies for what their parents did. Anyway, God came to the rescue. He so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, Jesus, etc., and tortured him to death under the belief that this would enable him to pardon the supposedly guilty mankind. And that's the core of Christianity. I've had many Christians that I've debated with say that that's their core belief, and if that was overturned they'd give up on Christianity. So here's our time to put that to the test. Now let's just think about that. Translate that into modern day terms. There's a court process, a court trial going on in the Downing Centre, and the judge says, I find that you, John Smith, robbed the bank. Therefore I seize you, Fred Nurk, walking along the footpath, an innocent third party, and sentence you to life with hard labour. Most people would look at the judge as insane and lock him away. But Christians hold this up as their core belief and their source of morality. So if anyone can explain that to me, I'd like to hear it. And all I can suggest is that they call that God's love, God showing his love for mankind, when in fact it's torture. And if Christians don't know the difference between love and torture, then perhaps that goes part way to explaining what the greatest Christian nation on earth did in Abu Ghraib prison and Guantanamo Bay detention centre. not knowing the difference between love and torture. So when people hold up the book and say that is our source of morals, I just say that we need to have more explanation, please. Okay, now one can ask the question, why is it that such a large slice of humanity believes in a God of some sort? I touched on this before, and it does seem to be, to secularists or scientific thinkers, to be inexplicable why people believe in something that is so very clearly and obviously an appalling source of morals, and they think that's where their morals come from. However, science has provided a possible answer to this as well, and that's based on the layered brain, because earlier animals in the evolutionary process, of course, had what's called a reptilian cortex, which is the inner part of their brain. Sorry, the reptilian brain, the inner part of their brain, and no cortex. And that means that typically reptiles react to what's around them in a very basic level without going through any sort of analysis. And as mammals developed, and the primates and humans, they developed a cortex on the outside of the reptilian brain and other layers in between, and the cortex is capable of conscious and analytical thought and can actually put together a debate or write a book or build an aeroplane or whatever. And behavioural studies show us that young animals tend to believe what their parents tell them. The reason being, of course, that if you've got a young monkey that's just born on the branch and his mother shows it how to hang onto the branch, and if it hangs onto the branch it'll live to grow up and then perhaps develop some more thinking skills afterwards. But if the baby says, I'm going to put this scientific theory to the test and let go of the branch, that's definitely bad for your survival value. So therefore young animals and humans are programmed to trust what their parents tell them. So let's look at the development of a child that grows up in a religious household and perhaps is taken to church by the parents and to Sunday school. It gets ingrained into the deepest layers of its brain all these ideas about a supernatural being and there being one true God and one true holy book, and all the morals flow from it. And then later on, at some sort of maturity, perhaps in high school or university, that child learns critical thinking skills, either by attending a course on critical thinking, or perhaps reading a book about it, or perhaps just some scientific training that teaches them how to analyse and test things and say, what's the evidence for that and what's the theory behind that? So that when that teenager perhaps learns critical thinking skills, it's very difficult for that person to challenge what they've already learnt, because that's at too deep a level. So the idea is that you can only challenge what you learn after you learn your critical thinking skills. That's a bit of an approximation, but there's some evidence in favour of that. Therefore, many of us who have strong religious beliefs against any sort of logic or reason are probably doing so because they were indoctrinated as children. And I'd like each of you here to reflect and say, if I believe in a God, I don't mind which God it is, and if I believe that one particular holy book is true and all the others are false, and if I believe in one prophet and so forth, could that be because I was indoctrinated into this belief before I developed critical thinking skills? And if you've got any sort of positive answer to that, you might like to consider whether it is ethical for churches and other religions to indoctrinate children into beliefs before they learn critical thinking, because they'll probably find it very difficult to shake off those beliefs, and it will harm them very greatly in their later life. Thank you.
Both Ian and I are struggling under what's part of the fun of debates, which is huge topics being raised in really a short time. And unlike me, you all have honest jobs. I'm just a minister, so I just have to wait till Dr. Phil comes on to fill in my day. So I can just sleep in and rest and get my sermons off the net. Has Graham told you about that, if you're like? I just wanted to quick responses. There's a great quote from a very fine atheist, now dead, Carl Sagan, and I do think that I've felt a few times this is relevant to the way that Ian's approaching this. And Carl Sagan writes this: "You can get into a habit of thought in which you enjoy making fun of all those other people who don't see things as clearly as you do. And we have to guard carefully against that." Making fun of all those people who don't see things as clearly as you do. We have to guard carefully against it. A number of times I feel, and I may be wrong on this, that Ian is making sort of the assumption that if you're a clever, rational, thoughtful, educated person with an open mind, you cannot possibly, conceivably, believe in all this nonsense about Jesus and God, etc., etc. Just keeping in that area of God and religion. I just think the problem with this is it's provably false. Ask Ian, if you like, was he brought up in a religious home and did he break free? Because if he did, he's either making a claim to be some sort of a Superman, or his theory about how things work is just nonsense. And his own life story can disprove the theory. I was brought up being sent to Sunday school. I hated it. I protested against it. The name was a shocker, Sunday school. Well, who thought of that name? But, I was an atheist by the time I was about 16 and was very reluctantly, and I was angry when I became a Christian, to have been convinced it was true. My story doesn't prove anything except that people change, sometimes for the better. You have a man like Francis Collins who's just completed a very impressive work in the mapping out of the human genome program. After he was a graduate scientist, he became convinced Christianity was true and became a Christian. Hardly a fool, hardly a man unable to think critically, given the baton to finish a very impressive work that was begun by an atheist, finished by a Christian. It's a great indication of the fact that some attempt to draw some sharp division between rational thinking people and science and religion is nonsense. The reason why people make these decisions are much more complicated than that. Of course, some of you will know that Anthony Flew, who was the outstanding academic atheist in the last third of the 20th century, has just caused enormous upset by not becoming Christian, but by saying he is now convinced that he was wrong earlier and that he is now convinced that there is a God. He says that he thinks that probably the most likely of all the contenders in front of him to be right is probably Christianity, but he's not a Christian. And he doesn't believe in life after death. Richard Dawkins, in a fury, which you could see on YouTube some time ago, said this is just fear of death. And of course Anthony Flew said he knows that's not true because I don't believe there's any life after death. I just think in the end, rationally, it makes more sense to believe that the way that the universe works, and particularly life works, is the result of an intelligence rather than an accident. So I think we need to tread carefully in just assuming that our position is the only intelligent one of free-thinking men and women. A quick thing on the which God. Christianity is well aware of the diversity of choice. When Christianity was born, it was a ridiculous little religion. If you were travelling around the first century and said, which religion of all these is going to survive, you wouldn't have even noticed Christianity. It was a provable joke. It was mocked by all. Christians have always known what it is to live in a diverse world, except perhaps for a few moments in Europe, when it might have lost that picture. But I don't think most intelligent Christians have ever lost the fact that the world is a very diverse place. The argument Jesus gives for why you should take him seriously, he says, tear apart my body and in 3 days' time I rebuild it. Christianity is the only religion that puts its head out and says, here is the area of test and proof. And I know no one who's spent any time looking at the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus who has not come away convinced. I know many who are not convinced, most of my family. But I'm not saying they don't exist. I used to say I knew one person, but then one time when she was drunk and we were having dinner together, she said, actually, I didn't know it's true. I just wasn't interested in having anyone tell me how to live. That's the question. So we're well aware there are many claims. And the fact that there are many false answers doesn't mean there isn't a right answer. There mightn't be a right answer. But the fact that, you have 2 + 2 is equal to what? And you get some people say 3, 4, blue, whatever. Oh, many answers. Give up. That's not how. You just have to study it more carefully. I was disappointed to be called a Mousterian. I'm not a lover of mystery. I normally speak sneeringly of the use of the word mystery, so Ian would need to know me a bit better before he worked out what box to put me in. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth is not an example of the Old and New Testament clashing. And again, I just think you should know better than that. If you're going to argue a case, which you've argued many times, read the context. Eye for eye, tooth for tooth is given by God to the magistrates of Israel. And it's telling them to give pure justice. What was common then, and is still true in many tribal countries, is that you lose an eye, I kill your whole family. The Code of Hammurabi, which people have sometimes foolishly said until they read it, is just like the Ten Commandments. It's completely different. When it depends what order you are in society, what happens to you. So if a peasant hurts a person higher up, them and their family get wiped out. If a rich person, a poor person, almost nothing happens. So what God says to the magistrates in Israel is eye for eye, tooth for tooth. If a king kills a peasant, he loses his life. If a peasant kills a king, he loses his life. That's what it's saying. And the problem Jesus is dealing with is people had taken what was said to the magistrates and brought it down to their personal relationships. And Jesus is condemning that. You just need to read these things a little more carefully. I cannot, say for example, if I see you do a terrible crime, if I think, right, that's worth 10 years and I lock you up under my house, guess who goes to prison? I do. Because I'm moving out of the area where I've got legitimate jurisdiction. It's said to the magistrates, and it's a beautiful thing to say to the magistrates, but in that time and now, we're not to bring that into our relations. We are to turn the other cheek. This is the mark of what Jesus says is true goodness. It's not just treating people averagely, it's treating people the way God, or at least the God that Jesus talks about, which is ridiculously generously. Well, I'll go back to the three basic points in the few remaining minutes. What I think happens for atheists, these are the soft atheists, the ones who haven't got the courage to go all the way, is that they know in their guts certain things are right and wrong, which is exactly what the Bible would indicate you would have, because they're made in the image of God. Whether they believe in God or not, they remain made in the image of God. The Bible speaks of the law of God being written in people's hearts, right? That people know certain things are right and wrong. Atheists know in their guts certain things are right and wrong. Now, they'll be wrong on some, like we all. Every culture's right and wrong in some areas. The problem is that their head doesn't agree with their gut. One of the things about a worldview that tests it is it able to explain, it's part of the power of the theory of evolution, is the fact that it's got tremendous explanatory power. All sorts of different bits of data we discover are well explained within the theory. Now, that doesn't prove it to be true, but it certainly points in its favour. And I think what I'm saying is that the trouble with atheism, when thought through consistently, is it runs into a massive clash between the gut, the heart, the feeling of life, which is a central part of life for humans, and their capacity to articulate a logical connection. And that is where, let me just give you some examples so you don't think this is being unfair. I've got a whole series of quotes here from good, hard, clear-thinking atheists. Let me give you one from John Dewey, famous for his work in libraries and education. There is no God, there is no soul. There is no room for fixed natural law or permanent moral absolutes. Michael Roos writes this, a professor of science, philosopher of science. The man who says that it's morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 is equal to 5. Right? So he's an absolutist on right and wrong. The position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation no less than the hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is an illusion. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction. Any deeper meaning is an illusion. Paul Kurtz, another atheist, says the central question about moral and ethical principles concerns their foundation. If they are neither derived from God nor anchored in some transcendental ground, they are purely ephemeral. Thoughtful atheists are not saying they don't feel there are things that are right and wrong, but they've got enough guts to say that they have no logical moral ought to them. All you can say is, I don't like it and I hope you agree, which is what Bertrand Russell said in his article, What I Do Believe. He made an ethical statement that says, I only hope you agree with me. Right? That's a very sad counsel in the end. You may have known, you may have read of the Nazi soldier, true story, not in Auschwitz but one of the other prison camps, who in a moment of ethical weakness took pity on a Jewish child and helped the Jewish child escape. He was overwhelmed for days with a terrible sense of guilt. That within his ethical world, it was right for the Superman to arise by getting rid of the polluting lower races. In the end, he went and confessed his sin to his fellow atheist Nazi officer. What would you say to that man? He has a perfectly coherent worldview, which rises, as Adolf did, from his embracement of Nietzsche's atheism. That God he is no more, the horizon has been wiped away. And Nietzsche said, unlike all the gullible people at the beginning of the 20th century who said this was going to be a century of near paradise, it's tragic reading. Nietzsche said, because Europe will finally realise that there is no God, this will be the bloodiest century in human history. He understood once you remove God, it has massive social repercussions. Now, if there's no God, too bad. You don't believe in something because it's socially convenient. Truth matters. Dostoevsky is the fellow who writes, had a huge, long journey, thinking and spiritually, etc., writes this: if God is not, then all things are permissible. And ultimately, logically, he's right. Solzhenitsyn, who played such a large part in undermining the credibility of the USSR, etc., was asked, how do you explain the fact that Stalin, under an articulate, atheistic, materialist worldview, killed 60 million of his own people? 60 million. Makes Hitler look like a schoolboy. Solzhenitsyn thought, and then his simple reply was, our nation forgot God. There is in the end a huge connection between weighty senses of what is right and wrong. Atheists are often very fine people, but it's the difficulty they have on saying, my gut has a logical, coherent reason. Blandness. Let me remind you again of what Jesus says. We tend to think of just being nice and not doing too much harm. The Good Samaritan, which people often speak, oh, he was a good Samaritan to someone. That's, again, such a bland mistake of it. The whole thing with the Samaritan story is that Samaritans and Jews hated each other's guts and did eye for eye again and again in deliberate acts of cruelty, culture to culture individuals, which, according to what Ian has said, is a good thing. I was amazed to think he thought that's not a bad thing. Well, welcome to Yugoslavia, welcome to the Middle East, welcome to all sorts of problems that can't be solved, which is what eye for eye, tooth for tooth does. The Good Samaritan loves the hated enemy. That's what Jesus says is good. So when your normal atheist or whatever, or your normal Australian says, I'm a pretty good person, they're talking twaddle compared to what Jesus says. Goodness is tested and seen when you deal with your enemy. That's the key. Because in the end, that is what we see in God. I'm disappointed to hear Ian's complete misunderstanding of the death of Jesus. I have little doubt he's had it explained to him before. But it is not a third party. Of course it's a wicked injustice if I get busted again breaking the speed limit and you lose your licence. Right? Which is the way that he spoke of it. That's not at all what Jesus thinks is going on. What Jesus says is, I and the Father are one. What Jesus is saying is not it's sort of some arbitrary, unjust procedure, but it's God in himself taking the consequence for our sin. And forgiveness always does that. If you've ever forgiven someone who has really hurt you, really hurt you, it is the most unnatural procedure in the universe. The natural, easy, instinctive animal thing is to take revenge. When I read Kerry Packer say, I'm a great friend but a terrible enemy, I thought, well, welcome to the primary school playground. Big deal. That's just instinctive animal behaviour. But this is to forgive someone. And what Jesus is doing is he is taking in himself, between the Father, Son and Spirit, this is a transaction going on. So it's not at all this arbitrary thing. It has always been mocked from the very beginning. You either think it's the most beautiful thing that has ever happened in the universe, which is what I do. That's why Christians didn't call it Black Friday but Good Friday. Or you mock it. That's not a 21st century thing, that's a first century thing. It happened way back then. It's still a great night. Well, I shall sit down. Keywords for us.
Okay, thanks Ian. I'll try and address several of those points you brought up as best I can. Firstly, you said that if there's no God, this will be the bloodiest century that we've seen, something like that. Well, I'd like to point out that, and to reinforce the fact that if there is a God, the century would be much bloodier than any we've ever seen. I described to you before the story of the Midianites. I can also tell you about the story of Lot's daughters. The fact, this is in Genesis chapter 19, where two angels came to Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting at the gate of Sodom, and so forth. And the crowd said, "Bring those angels out to us that we may know them carnally." Apparently they wanted to bugger them, to put it in the vernacular. And Lot said, "See now, I have two daughters who have not known a man. Please let me bring them out to you, and you may do with them as you wish." So again, you see another message where it's okay to treat your daughters as bargaining material with your enemies and let them be pack raped. In fact, there are at least two other stories in the Bible where men send their wives out to be pack raped all night by their enemy in an attempt to appease the enemy. And when she crawls back to the door in the morning and knocks on the door, he basically opens the door and says, "Come in and make me breakfast." And this is the word of God, of your God speaking. So I don't think that stands up very well. And let's perhaps say that this was just the Old Testament. It was just merely the ancient myths rather than the Word of God. Let's look at now what Jesus said. This is in Matthew chapter 5. "Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till it is all fulfilled." So there, Jesus is saying that he completely 100% affirms the law of the prophets, including the laws that Moses made that I read to you before about the Midianites and the other crimes. So Jesus reinforced it. So we have not only God number one, Jesus saying it, but God number the Old Testament God saying it, but we have God number two, Jesus saying it, and it's written in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's been repeated by most theologians since then. So that's a characteristic of the Christian faith, that they hold up morals like that and pretend that they're good morals. Now I'd like to touch briefly on the credibility of the Old Testament, and we're going to, because we had a discussion on Friday night where we touched on the authority of the various Gospels and their accuracy and so forth. So this is a bit out of my area. I'm a scientist rather than a Bible scholar. But let's look at Julius Caesar. Now, Julius Caesar lived from 100 BC to 44 BC, and about the same time as Jesus. He's got the same initials, lived in the same area in the Middle East. And what evidence do we have of Julius Caesar's existence and deeds? We have his own commentaries in his own writing. We have Cicero's reports, both speeches and writing, who saw him personally. We see a writer called Sallust, who also wrote extensively and knew Julius Caesar and recorded from day to day his activities. And we even have busts of him carved by people who saw him. So here we have an influential leader in the Middle East at that period, and 100 different ways of confirming their existence and their deeds. Let's compare that with Jesus Christ now for a moment. And we'll say that if there really is a Christian God who wanted to get this message out, being all-powerful and so forth, he would have no trouble at all in getting out the message a bit stronger than Julius Caesar, you would think, if it was for real. So is that what we find? Let's look at the Gospels, for example. The earliest Gospel is called Mark, which was written about 70 AD, that is about 40 years after Jesus died. We have Matthew and Luke, which are apparently copies of Mark, so they don't count either, apparently from the same text. We have, and they were not even named until 180 AD, so therefore they were probably not even written by Matthew, Mark and Luke at all. And then we have the Gospel according to John, which is entirely different. And you can go through the chain all the way up and find that there is no credibility whatsoever to any of the accounts of the Bible. Genesis has 2 accounts: Moses leading the children out of Egypt, no evidence whatsoever. Camels existing when they didn't, when there's no record of them in the archaeological record, and so on and so forth. And even the early Christian gods, Yahweh, Elohim, Jehovah, Asherah. So God had a wife in one of the stories. Zarathustra and Zoroaster, all equally changing from year to year. So if I might summarise, a scientist, when he's confronted with a claim, or the skeptic with some paranormal belief, he can apply 3 tests. Imagine a stool, an old milkman's stool with 3 legs. The 3 legs are evidence. Is there evidence that this claimed phenomenon exists? Is there a theory on which it may exist? And is there credibility of the people who wrote it? And if any one of these legs falls off the stool, it falls over and would be discarded by a rational person. If we find the Christian belief in all religions, in fact, all 3 legs are basically turned to sawdust and don't exist. So that would be the judgment which would be applied to religions given any sort of critical thinking. Thank you.
Mr. Timekeeper, going to ask for another minute, like you usually time. You'll get some money later, Graham. Thank you very much. Right. Ian has told some terrible stories tonight, which presumably means he believes them and he thinks they're good. So he's told us the story of Lot. He has reported the story, so he must believe it's okay to do. That's the same sort of logic he's using when the Bible tells you the story of what Lot, who is not a hero in the Bible, he's an idiot in the Bible. Right? He's living in a city he shouldn't have lived in. He's in love with it. He can't leave it, although God warns him. Presumably because Ian tells the story, Ian believes it because that's what the Bible's doing. When you've got a book that is telling you history, it's going to have some pretty terrible things in it, unless it's not real history. Because humans of every shape and colour do terrible things. You do terrible things. We all have things we regret. Right? We all, as Mark Twain said, humans are the only animals that blush and the only ones that need to. There are all things that you and I need forgiveness for. The Bible will record those things for us, and then we can learn things if we're willing to read them with a semi-open mind. The remarkable thing about Jesus is that there is any reference to him at all outside the New Testament. It's impossible for us to conceive what an insignificant little blip, wasn't even a blip on the horizon Jesus was. The number of people that the Romans crucified is extraordinary in Jerusalem. Far larger movements following false messiahs than what happened with Jesus were wiped out by the Romans. You wouldn't expect to find anything, but surprisingly, you do. Let me give you some examples. Tacitus, the Roman historian, the famous, eminent Roman historian, studied at Sydney University where I'm the chaplain, mentions Jesus Christ and when he died. Josephus, a famous Jewish historian, speaks of Jesus and his brothers, which is interesting. In fact, he refers to a man who gets put to death and he identifies him by saying, James, whose brother was Jesus, the so-called Christ, which is like saying Bill, whose brother was John Howard, So it's pretty clear this guy existed. Josephus has got quite a bit about Jesus. Some is contested, but that one certainly isn't. The Talmud, which is the Jewish writings about Jesus, written by the rabbis, the people who had Jesus put to death, they talk about Jesus a number of times. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus III says 5 things about him. Now, if you know anything about the Bible, it's interesting to know what he says. He says, he is a false teacher. He says he had disciples and he names 5 of them. He is a blasphemer, for he was man made himself out to be God. He was put to death on the eve of the Passover. He says he will return, but he will not, for he is a liar. Right? This is not a friendly commentary. Right? But there's not a shred of doubt in any historian's mind that Jesus Christ was a real figure of history. What you got with the numbers about the Gospels, and I don't mean to be rude, was the very best of 19th century history from Germany. There's been a whole century and a half since then, seriously reworking some of the dates of some of the German schools on the Gospels. We have scraps of the Gospels, that is, evident bits of papyrus with the Gospels on it from within 20 or 30 years of them. So the whole dating thing, clearly you can't have a scrap of a Gospel if the Gospel wasn't written till after that date. I mean, it's not using good logic and evidence at that point. I think Carl Sagan's right. We've got to treat other positions with respect, because there are very intelligent Christians and very intelligent Muslims and very intelligent agnostics and very intelligent atheists, and the way to deal with it is not just to send up the position in really what ends up being sort of half-truths. So, I think in the end, we cannot be good enough without God, because in the end, goodness is reduced to preference. Thankfully, most of the time we agree, sometimes we don't. I learnt this recently again at my cousin-in-law. She comes from a long family of atheists, clearly brainwashed, three generations of atheists. Her opinion is worth nothing, because she was brought up as an atheist. But she is what I call a sad and honest atheist. We had this conversation. She says, I know in the end that I am worth nothing. Those I love are worth nothing. It all comes to nothing. My work means nothing. She's a very ethical woman. She left a highly paid job to go another job which did less damage. But she understands here it's fundamentally meaningless. Right? She's like a European, she's like a Nietzschean atheist. She's got the guts not to be an intellectual hypocrite. And I just think in the same way as Christians get hammered for being hypocrites, rightly, because that's what that whole attack on hypocrites comes from Jesus. That's how it entered our tradition. So I think atheists need to have enough courage to say, listen, all we've got is preferences and we hope you agree. And it is difficult. Sodom and Gomorrah get destroyed, as you probably know, not because of the attempted homosexual rape. That's 1 minute, beautiful. They get destroyed, we're told in the prophet Ezekiel, because their view of goodness was so limp and pathetic. What God says is, here's why he destroyed those cities: because they were prosperous, arrogant, and cared nothing for the poor. Again and again you'll find that why the Bible says people get in trouble with God is not because of what they do, but it's because of what they don't do. They don't care enough. They don't inconvenience themselves for the poor. They could make a huge difference and they make a tiny difference. The thing that in the end brought that community to an end was their complete indifference to the poor. The Midianites were a disgusting, violent, evil, appalling culture. And there are times when God will bring cultures to an end. He is a God who loves what is right, is tolerant for quite some time, but in the end will come to judgment with cultures and with you and I. There's nothing insipid about the goodness that the Bible speaks of. Therefore, we need someone to help us before God.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a great evening, and whether you are even further convinced that the position you've walked in with tonight is the right one, or whether you've been stimulated to think the issues through further, either way, you will agree that our debaters have given of themselves, both to the issues thoroughly this evening, and also we're very grateful to them for their time given in travelling up here and in the preparation. It's no easy thing to prepare for an event like this. So we need to again express our thanks.
Well, thanks for joining me today for the Skeptic Zone and hearing that interesting debate. And thank you to all the people who continue to sponsor our show by making small contributions via our website at www.skepticzone.tv and clicking on the PayPal button. Your contributions really do make a difference and means we can keep the show online week after week. Join me again next week, me and Stefan, of course, for the regular show with Dr. Rachie Reports, A Grain of Salt, The Think Tank, and all the features that we hope you enjoy. Until then, this is Richard Saunders from Sydney, Australia.
You've been listening to The Skeptic Zone. Visit our website at www.skepticzone.tv for comments, contacts, and extra video reports.